Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to briefly discuss forestry, particularly the ways in which forests are managed through timber harvest. Now, the timber harvest method that comes to mind most frequently would be clear cutting, and that's why we included that on the title here. Now, just to refresh your memory, remember a forest is a section of land that is dominated by trees and other woody vegetation. And in some instances, these forests are used for commercial timber harvests or commercial logging. Now, again, remember that trees are going to absorb pollutants and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And when a tree is cut down, those pollutants and that carbon is then leached into the soil, and that carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. Now, the key here is to have more trees growing than are being cut down to have a good balance in that carbon cycle. Commercial timber operations are primarily privately owned. However, about 27% take place on public land. This would be National Forest land or Bureau of Land Management land or any other government agency, either at the state or federal level. Now, in order for this to happen, there is this bit of an exchange that takes place, and this is called a royalty. So the timber harvest company or the timber operation is going to make an agreement with that government agency where the timber company can use that land and harvest that timber as long as they pay a certain percentage of those profits back to the agency that kind of owns or manages that land. Now, the problem with this is that the government actually spends a bit more money on this management and facilitating these programs than they actually receive in royalties. So, in effect, that logging industry, in some instances, not all, they're effectively subsidized, meaning that they're not paying that true cost of using that land. Now, there are three main timber harvest practices, and we'll go through them one at a time. You need to really focus in on the pros and cons of each and the overall description of what is happening. Do not get bogged down in all of the details on these. Now, the first type is called clear cutting, and this is exactly what it sounds like. You are clearing the land by cutting down all of the trees. Now, the benefits is that it's pretty quick to do, it's pretty low risk, it's pretty economical, but there are some pretty significant downsides. There's a reduction in biodiversity. After you cut down all the trees in an area, it only really remains space for fast-growing, direct sunlight-loving species when you replant. There's also less valuable species that are going to be harvested, similar to bycatch fishing. And of course, there's going to be habitat destruction and fragmentation. Now, the other four disadvantages you might not think of right away. However, you do need to know them. Just knowing one is not quite enough. So there's going to be this increase in erosion from wind and from water. So that water can lead to mudslides where whole sections of soil are just sliding off the face of the land. And that sediment moving down the landscape, that can get into waterways and cause what's called sedimentation. And that increases the turbidity or the amount of stuff suspended in that water column. Now, the final one you might not initially think of, and there's actually increased water temperatures associated with clear cutting. And this is because even if you remove all the trees from an area, that stream is still going to run through there. And now that stream no longer has shade from those trees protecting it from the sunlight. And this allows that sunlight to heat up the water much quicker. Now, there's also these things called tree plantations that are associated with clear cutting. These are often on that private land that some timber companies own. And what happens here is a single species is planted, often in rows, and this allows for very quick and effective clear cutting of just that plot, and then immediate replanting with a fast-growing species. This tries to concentrate that impact of the timber harvesting in a smaller area, but there are still downsides to this because those areas are never going to fully become a diverse ecosystem, and we're going to see some nutrient depletion from the soil. But keep in mind, the middle of a subdivision is never really going to be a truly diverse ecosystem either. So there's pros and cons to these. The second type of timber harvest is called selective cutting. And this again, you are selecting or choosing only certain trees to cut down. And there's benefits because you're allowing these young saplings after the harvest to grow up alongside some of the remaining old growth trees. This allows for those shade tolerant trees to regenerate in a particular area more quickly. There's less erosion, less impact to biodiversity, etc. But there are disadvantages. We still do have some fragmentation of the habitat. We still have logging roads crisscrossing an area. Here's another way to look at that selective cutting or that selective harvest, where we have a pretty healthy, pretty well functioning forest ecosystem throughout most of this timber harvest cycle. Now, the final type is called ecologically sustainable forestry. Now, this is something that's much more expensive than the other two options. However, this is primarily done by people who are ecologically conscious of maintaining biodiversity. So an example is using horses instead of heavy machinery, just like in the old days, to pull the logs from where you cut them out to a processing area. Now, there's benefits because there's less soil compaction, there's less fossil fuel emissions, the logging roads are not quite as wide, you can weave in and out and be more selective of what you harvest. But the downside is it's much, much more expensive and it's pretty difficult to compete with the volume of timber produced by those mechanized practices. Now, logging does lend itself towards having a lot of conflict. Now, we need timber to build homes and all of the timber and wood and paper products that we use in our daily lives. But we also need to maintain biodiversity because these trees grow in forests, which are part of the overall ecosystem. Now, an example would be the northern spotted owl. Now, this owl is an endangered species and an indicator species, meaning it gives us a bit of a pulse check on how the overall ecosystem health looks. They live only in old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. And back in 1991, a court actually stopped all logging in a particular area because it was discovered that the northern spotted owl lived there. And since the Endangered Species Act says you cannot alter or disturb the habitat of an endangered species, that logging could no longer take place. Now, as you would expect, there was quite a bit of uproar. Many logging jobs were actually lost as a result because the project couldn't go through and they didn't have another timber harvest lined up, so they were essentially laid off for a little while. And the timber industry actually used this as an example of excessive overreach by the environmental activist movement. But something to keep in mind is that there were already quite a few jobs being lost in the logging industry at that time due to a decline in the demand for old growth forest products and the decline in the availability to harvest from old growth forests, and also automation in the logging industry. Now, this really was a big deal. It was not an isolated kind of incident that flew under the radar. We actually saw loggers producing propaganda saying, hey, save a logger, eat an owl. Like, we don't need these out here. It's more about our jobs and our economy. And this issue got to be so large that it actually ended up on the cover of Time magazine. Now, in summary, you do need to know those three main categories of timber harvest techniques: clear cutting, selective cutting, and ecological sustainable forestry. Make sure you know a little bit about each of them along with the pros and cons. Please send me your questions here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.